Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Neguse, and I have the honor and privilege of representing Colorado's 2nd Congressional District in the United States Congress. I also serve as a member of the Congressional Black Caucus Executive Board, and I am so delighted to be able to join such a wonderful group of panelists today for an important conversation on developing environmental policy for all. All of us have read the IPCC report that was released just a week ago today. That report makes clear one simple fact, that there is no time to waste in the fight against climate change, the existential threat of our time. From preserving our public lands to protecting our environment, ensuring that our children have clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and wonderful outdoor spaces in both urban, suburban, and rural areas are all a top priority for the Congress and for the Congressional Black Caucus. And it is critical as we do that work that we apply an equity lens to environmental justice and ensure that environmental policy that we are crafting at the federal level, both in legislation and on the regulatory side, are done in a way to ensure that it accounts for the reality that Black and Brown communities are often on the front lines of ultimately experiencing the visceral impacts of climate change each and every day. It is with that in mind that I am so delighted to be able to be joined by an incredible group of panelists from across the country, each of whom has spent their careers serving the public and the greater good, and in particular, working on issues of environmental justice. We are honored to be able to be joined today by Happy Haynes, a legend in Denver, in Colorado, the executive director of Parks and Recreation for the City and County of Denver, the former deputy mayor of the City and County of Denver, and also a trailblazer in her own right. Also, Taisha Adams, policy director for Outdoor Afro, an exciting organization doing incredible things here in Colorado and across the country as it relates to our public lands and engaging the Black community in the same. Leslie G. Fields, national director of policy, advocacy, and legal for one of the country's oldest and most well-regarded environmental advocacy organizations, the Sierra Club. And Laura Mentish, the communications director from Mobilize Green, an organization that is on the front lines of working in the fight against climate change. And we know Laura will provide more insight into her role and her organization's unique role in the broader fight to protect our planet. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Happy Haynes, our first panelist, Director Haynes, with a question, which is how you and your organization approach environmental justice.
Thank you, Congressman Neguse, for inviting me to participate on this very important panel. When it comes to health, climate change, and even economic opportunities in our communities, this is such an important conversation. In a recent podcast with the Center for Western Priorities, we discussed a study that had been commissioned by the Hispanic Access Foundation last year that found that the United States has fewer forests, streams, wetlands, and other natural places near where Black, Latino, and Asian American people live. Notably, families with children, especially families of color with children, have less access to nature nearby than the rest of the country. In other words, these communities are nature deprived. This reality about these inequities is what motivates us every day at Denver Parks and Recreation. We may not be able to solve the problems around income, education, and housing disparities, but we see that parks and open space can be an equalizer as it relates to the quality of life by planning and investing with an equity focus. And in this first slide that you'll see is an equity map and index that we use in Denver, Colorado to help guide the decisions that we make in everything that we do to help close the gaps in those disparities. If you'll turn to the second slide, it shows how we use these indicators to help guide every decision that we make, most notably how we spend our budget and the actions we take in improving and building new facilities. As I was growing up, I lived within walking distance of one of Denver's largest parks, and that access and my experiences there have a lot to do with how I got here today. We want to have every child and family to have similar opportunities and experiences. That's why we've adopted the Trust for Public Lands 10-minute walk or roll standard, and that our 20-year strategic plan, the game plan for a healthy city, is focused on creating more nature-based spaces and activities in our historically underserved neighborhoods. Our current outdoor master plan effort is dedicated to closing these opportunity gaps in access to nature, whether it's close to home parks or the 14,000 acres of mountain parks that are part of our system. According to an article published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, exposure to green space, even in a limited setting like an urban residential street, is just as beneficial for health as visiting a natural setting or a large public park. So this is the research supports the need for our families, and particularly in our underserved communities, to have the access they need to the great outdoors. And we know that any time spent outside, whether exercising or not, can provide benefits to emotional, physical, and mental health. We have a similar focus on issues around resilience and protecting the most vulnerable communities in our city from the disproportionately severe impacts of climate change. Flooding issues, urban heat island effects, air and water quality impacts are targets for our equity-based strategies. The strategies for addressing these impacts include stormwater management for flood mitigation and water quality improvements, protecting and enhancing the urban tree canopy to combat urban heat islands, as well as reducing costs and increasing energy efficiency. And finally, cleaning up, restoring habitat, and increasing recreational access on our river and waterways. So improving the quality of the environment and improving access and making equitable investments in parks and open space is simply not enough. In diversity, equity, and inclusion work, the I is the most important component: inclusion. If folks don't have a seat at the table and power to shape the menu, then we're just doing missionary work. And if you'll turn to the next slide, please. There's nothing wrong with that, but we can and must do better. We have to shift our thinking and our way of doing business from just serving the community to co-creating with the community. And the slide you see here represents young people at our new Montbello open space that was funded with wildlife funds, Land and Water Conservation Fund funds that we're very proud of. And these young people designed and created with us this new natural prairie landscape right in the heart of their community. So one of the key strategies for making the transformation that is needed is increasing BIPOC representation in the industry, increasing career awareness and job opportunities in conservation, environmental disciplines, engineering, and outdoor recreation, just to name a few, is essential to increasing BIPOC representation and guaranteeing our seats at the table. That includes internships, fellowships, scholarships, environmental education programs like the one you see represented here for our youth, followed by targeted hiring and contracting opportunities for small businesses in our high needs neighborhoods. All of these efforts will increase meaningful and long-lasting stewardship of our natural resources in communities that should benefit the most from raising this bar. And finally, to the last slide, saving the best for last, I want to highlight the pilot project that you had a chance to visit, Congressman, that connects the physical restoration of an historic civilian conservation camp in one of our mountain parks with the workforce and skills training that the original CCC camps historically provided. This project combines nearly all of the key strategies I just mentioned. The first cohort of this pilot program started this summer, and we are so gratified, Congressman, that you are sponsoring new legislation that will revive the CCC program nationally. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Happy, for being here, and again, for your leadership, and certainly a lot of exciting things happening in the city and county of Denver. With that, I'd like to now turn it over to Taisha with the same question, Taisha, of how you and your organization approach environmental justice.
Of course, it's my pleasure. So again, Taisha Adams with Outdoor Afro. And, I think back to my earliest memories of sitting at the side of the public pool with my life jacket on, watching my mother on the high chair as she served as a lifeguard. I can still smell the chlorine and feel that feeling of your wrinkled fingers when you've just been in wet all day. And though I was raised with this deep connection to nature, I always felt like the exceptional Negro, the exceptional Black person, because I was the only Black person at the pool or at the park at the time in the 70s. And so imagine my surprise decades later when I come to Outdoor Afro and I go to my first event at Staunton State Park here in Colorado, and I'm greeted by 25 other Black people on the trail. And again, we've been hiding in plain sight all along, Black people, and our strong connection to nature. But to have that elevated in this experience at Staunton State Park, to see that I wasn't exceptional, that I belonged, and that there was this historical tradition that I had not known about that is now open to me. And so I come to this work with a love of nature, always strong in my heart, but a growing understanding, a deepening understanding of the historical and current contributions of Black people in the stewardship of our lands, wildlife, and waterways, not only for play, but also for work. I think of our scientists and our lawyers and our legislators, many of whom are on this call right now. But I also think to our founder, Rue Mapp, the founder of Outdoor Afro, and she often says that Outdoor Afro is a love story rooted in the understanding that all beings are connected and interdependent. A love story that centers the leader within. Notice our mission is very simple: to connect and inspire and celebrate Black connections to nature. And again, that love story that centers that leadership, not just the connection to, but the leadership within. So we've got now over 100 Outdoor Afro leaders serving in 33 states across the country and in 56 cities, excuse me. And as I think about environmental justice and that work and that legacy and how Outdoor Afro intersects, it is around love and that intersection between people and planet and the unwillingness to disconnect them. And so although Outdoor Afro is not a traditional environmental justice organization, our work is deeply rooted in the many principles that were identified in the 1991 First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. I think back to some of those principles around interdependence, those principles around self-determination, those principles around ensuring a seat at the table from at every major decision-making level, not just at the needs assessment component, but also in the design, the implementation, and the evaluation. And again, thinking about who is at the table and making sure that the expertise is there as well. I think of obviously Dr. Robert Bullard's work, right? Hiding in plain sight all along, or Dr. Dorcetta Taylor's work. There is a rich legacy codified in practice, codified through our research that lifts up the current contributions or historical contributions and the role of Black people and Black Americans specifically as it relates to the stewardship of our lands, wildlife, and waterways. And yet we continue to be disproportionately impacted negatively by the decisions that have been made in the past and that are currently being made. So at Outdoor Afro, we are about disrupting that false perception that Black people have not and do not play a role in the stewardship of our lands, wildlife, and waterways, as well as in outdoor recreation. We're also working to shift the representation of who can lead and who can inform natural resource management, and of course, the stewardship of our recreation as well. And then lastly, working to restore the connection between people and planet, whether it be from our backyards and our local communities, all the way to the great wilderness beyond. I often look out and I see the beautiful peaks and snow-capped mountains. And I look out, when I first moved here, I just thought, oh, pretty mountains. Now I look and I go, oh, that's my drinking water, right? We are in constant relationship. And so Outdoor Afro is about healing and acknowledging that relationship. And so again, very excited for the conversation today.
Thank you, Taisha, for your work. And one of my first jobs was as a lifeguard, so I can certainly relate to that story that you told. But next, we will ask Leslie to answer the same question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Congressman Neguse. I am very honored to be with all of you today. And I bring you greetings from the Sierra Club, and it feels great to be here. And as you know, the Sierra Club is the oldest, largest environmental organization in the country. We were founded in 1892. We have about 64 chapters and all over the country. We have many chapters in California. That's why there's like more than 50 states. And I've been with the National Sierra Club for 14 years. And I am very proud to say that the Sierra Club has been deeply involved in environmental justice on many different levels for a very long time. And I also believe that access to nature and access to green space is an environmental justice issue. It's a human rights issue. And it's really, it's very unfair to follow Taisha's story, but I too grew up exposed to nature through my grandparents. My brother and I hunting and fishing with our grandparents. And that legacy, particularly, it was a semi-rural area in Western Pennsylvania, but that legacy all over the country. We have that legacy. Every culture fishes, okay? Human civilization was founded on water bodies. And so fishing, relaxing, recreating on water bodies, this is something that is definitely in our culture. And I'm very grateful that our grandparents exposed it to us. We had so much fun. We'd fish all day and then play cards all night, that sort of thing. And so, and I also was able to experience nature. I got scholarship to some Quaker camps in Vermont as a teenager. And that's where I became a lifeguard and got my WSI and learned how to do long distance swimming, learned how to be outdoors in a very stringent way, and hiking. And I've enjoyed that my whole life, tried to make sure that other people have that access as well. I've very much enjoyed coming out to Colorado when I can, and have been to Estes Park many times, had friends who work there, and it's just a fantastic state, and the ethos of environmentalism is very strong in Colorado, and we appreciate that. It makes a difference here in DC. So the Sierra Club has been involved. We started out, we are a conservation organization, and I want to bring you greetings from our Outdoors for All program and our Land, Water, and Wildlife programs, both led by dynamic women Jackie Ostfeld and Chris Hill, respectively. Our Outdoors for All program includes our military outdoors, our Inspiring Connections outdoors, our Nearby Nature. We're part of that Outdoors Alliance for Kids. Our Land, Water, and Wildlife protects wildlife. We are very involved in forests and climate and the border, and fighting oil and gas development on public lands. I've been able to go up to Alaska and fly fish with my good friend Chris Hill, who is the head of the Lands, Water, and Wildlife program, and the first African-American woman to do so. And so she's an expert fly fisher woman, and had that great experience 2 years ago before COVID. And so, as I mentioned, environmental justice includes access to nature. We started working on environmental justice in the early 90s. And we had, for a long time, a wonderful EJ organizer in Memphis, who's now on our national board. She started a camp for kids to get kids outside the Riverview camp in Memphis, Tennessee. We've had that legacy of bringing young people in, and we've had our Sierra Student Coalition. We have our My Generation program, and it's extremely important to bring young folks in, and also been very involved in making sure that there's access to outdoors, particularly in one example would be in Southern California, and the work to get to San Gabriel's Mountain and to make sure that there was transit to San Gabriel's, and all of those wonderful opportunities for folks to break down the barriers, to make sure that there's access to green space. Here in DC, we've worked very hard on cleanups all over the region. There's a wonderful program with the Women's Environmental Leadership Program, Smithsonian, who has been chronicling the oral histories of communities. And that's very exciting, because if you protect the natural environment, as you all well know, you protect the cultural environment. And protecting people's cultures, whether indigenous, whether folks who have just come to this United States and bringing their cultures, where you have an identification of migratory birds by people from south of the border, because they know that these birds travel all those way back and forth, is very exciting that some organizations work on, and also to have the elders with young folks. So we, and I'm particularly thinking about our military outdoors program. We have worked with many families, and vets who've come back, and we know from studies that being in nature and being in outdoors helps them with the stress that they were inflicted upon by serving our country. And so I'm very proud of the work that the Sierra Club continues to do and has done in the past. We have a very long history, which I'm not going to take the time up, but our Colorado chapter is very active, as you know, and most of our, and as is the rest of our state chapters. Environmental justice has been about making a way when there's been no way. And we do have also a history of not being inclusive, and we're working very hard on that. And also we're working very hard with, a silver lining about COVID has been the democratization of access. Now folks don't have to try to travel to Washington, D.C. or to a state capital, as you know, they can get on Zoom just like everybody else. And that has democratized the access to important places, to important stakeholders, and just being on the table, but also setting their own tables, making sure that the resources, the financial resources, the funders, all these institutions are part of democratizing and getting more access for folks who look like us and our families to be outside and to have the health benefits, and also to be able to protect nature and protect our planet. And so I love EJ because I meet the best people. I'm here with you all, okay? It's taken me all over the world. It's global, as you well know, and there will be many people from all over the world in Glasgow, Scotland for the UN COP26 Conference of Parties on the Climate Summit. And because it's very serious right now. We are seeing the huge, terrible effects of climate and climate disruption. So the people most affected are the ones who have the best solutions. And I feel it's incumbent on us to make sure that those folks have the access. Everyone has the access around to nature and environment, a clean and healthy environment. And it's incredibly important for people's spiritual, emotional, and mental health, which we don't talk about enough. We saw a great increase of folks using the parks, using outdoor spaces, during this pandemic. And I think that that's another silver lining to this pandemic. And so we have to make sure that they are maintained. I'm excited about the new CCC bill. Here in the Washington, D.C., the original CCC was segregated, and there's still, I'm an avid biker. And so we have the Anacostia Trail, and along the Anacostia Trail on the side where the Arboretum is a low retaining wall. That wall was built by the all Negro colored CCC 80 years ago, and it is still in great shape. They built that wall to last. And I rode my bike yesterday and I looked at it and I was thinking about it. And so that legacy is strong. And those men worked very hard in difficult conditions and they weren't supported as they should have been, but they have, and anytime you all want to come, I can show it to you, but we're very proud of that and that work. And so delighted to be part of this panel and also to support the work, the great work that's going on with your organizations and all over the country and your legislation, Congressman Neguse. And I'm also, I have to say, I'm an avid outdoor Afro participant here in the DMV, and Rumap's a great friend, and I'm very proud of her and Outdoor Afro as well, and all the work that's being done all over the country. I'm happy, I've heard about you for years, and delighted to finally meet you. And also, you know, this work is so important because it brings us all together, you know, and it's like, that's what's also very exciting, even if we can't see each other in person. And I really, really appreciate, and also Laura spent time in DC and she's back, and I look forward to meeting her on the trail. So we have a lot of people who worked very, very hard to clean up these rivers, clean up these areas, so that, because for many years, children didn't have a relationship to these rivers, right? They were polluted and they were dangerous. And we've seen statistics where particularly African-American children have a high percentage of drowning because they don't have the opportunity to learn how to swim, and it's dangerous. And so we were trying to remedy that. And so people have a relationship to the river and have a relationship to the trails. There's a Marvin Gaye trail here now. And so it's very exciting, and it's still all environmental justice. And it's, you know, I love it because anybody can be involved. You can be a young person, you can be a professional, you can be an elder, and as long as you care about your community, and that's where the justice is. And it's also joyous work. This is not drudgery. This is a lot of fun. And I saw those slides look like fun. So this work's been going on in the Denver area. So this is very joyous work because we protect the natural environment. We then protect the cultural environment. And we see it threatened everywhere. And so I'm very proud to be with you all and happy to appreciate your attention, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Leslie, again for your work, and certainly going to take you up on your offer to come see the Triple C the remnants of the project that you mentioned on the trail. It's an important project to me, important legislation that we've been pursuing, and the point you make about the Triple C in the 21st century being far more open to Black and Brown folks, and that we want to make sure the Triple C of the 21st century reflects the rich diversity of our entire country is a really important priority of my office and of the CBC. So thank you. And now we will turn to Laura. And Laura, my apologies for mispronouncing your last name, which happens to me all the time. So I apologize. But thank you so much for being here with us.
That's all right. I understand. My maiden name was even more complicated. So that's the life I live. I'm a Denver native, so I'm really happy to be sitting with so many Colorado folks, although I don't have any lifeguard experience and I feel kind of left out, but I could do it later, I think. But anyways, my name is Laura and I'm the communications director at Mobilize Green. And Mobilize Green is an environmental equity nonprofit that jumpstarts careers in green STEM for top tier diverse talent by connecting them with paid internships with the federal government and other organizations. And how we address environmental justice is by creating this career pipeline for the next generation of diverse leaders who will be able to advocate for their own communities and help solve our climate crisis with their innovative ideas and perspectives. I just wanted to give a little walkthrough on what we do. We start with a youth program, our Youth Conservation Corps. And in this program, we hire leaders who are either going through college and pursuing degrees in the STEM field. And then we hire crew members who are high school students that are also interested in conservation. We have a college program, which is just for internships for college-age students who are also pursuing degrees in STEM fields. And after college, we have a resource assistant program where we hire students into these positions with several federal agencies, and they have the ability to complete a direct hiring certificate for a full-time position. And we're proud of all of our programs, but especially our resource assistant program. Out of almost all of the nonprofits in this space, we have the highest conversion rate of graduates out of that program into full-time roles at 45%. Mobilize Green was founded in 2014, and since then we've had 2,000 participants come through our program. We're 70% diverse, and all of the work that these wonderful kids have done, well, I shouldn't say kids, young people, have done has netted $3 million in value. They've served over 300,000 hours in their work, and we have internships across all 50 states and some territories. So for us, correcting and dealing with environmental justice issues really is about facilitating the success and leadership of young people of color so that they can go into their own communities with the training, the skills, the education, all of the things that people claim are necessary for them to have the seat at the table. And not just a seat at the table, but really have leadership roles as we start dealing with some of these issues and figuring out the solutions to our climate crisis. So I'm really excited to be talking with all of you and just explaining what Mobilize Green does and the things that we're excited about these young people are doing and completing in their jobs. So thanks.
Well, thank you, Laura. And the point you made is such a salient one in terms of folks having a leadership role, not just necessarily a seat at the table. And it's a great segue into the first question that I wanted to pose to all of you. And Leslie, you kind of touched on this a little bit when you were talking about environmental justice and the communities that are the most impacted having oftentimes the best solutions to offer. And so I just wonder, you know, from your perspective, I think we all recognize that climate change disproportionately impacts underrepresented communities. But I wonder if you all might be willing to talk a little bit about sort of expounding on that, of how climate change disproportionately impacts underrepresented communities and what we do to address it. And of course, some of you have already touched on this in your opening remarks, but what are the best ways that we can ultimately address that disparity? And maybe we'll start with you, Leslie, and since you kind of touched on this, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, climate change, climate disruption, it's the threat multiplier, all right? It multiplies and exacerbates all the existing inequalities. So due to our history in this country of slavery toward Native Americans and African Americans, terrible, violent Jim Crow period, and then of course, all the incumbent redlining, segregation, and we have communities that have been, we're only allowed to live in certain parts of the country. These are called the bottoms, all right? So now it's the floodplain. Communities who still do not have access, who still do not have sewers, they still do not have clean water along the border or Native American reservations. And these people are all taxpayers, by the way. These are all Americans. And so have been denied these services. And you couple that on top of low educational attainment in some communities, terrible access to transit and jobs, and now we have COVID and all the other health disparities. So it's really in a syndemic right now. It's multiple pandemics, and so so climate change threatens all these folks in terms of their livelihoods, in terms of their economic development. We have the same communities that particularly, I'm always thinking, we've done a lot of work in the Gulf. We have chapters and great volunteers in the Gulf and the EJ communities we've worked with for a very, very long time in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Carolinas. Storm after storm, the Gulf is getting warmer, the seas are rising. And so you have a plethora of hurricanes that are stronger and longer and more frequent. Coupled on the fact that we have development by the oil and gas industry, which has destroyed a lot of the wetlands and the bayous. So these areas have always had storms, but you had wetlands and bayous that soaked it up. They were like the sponges. And now those have been destroyed by development from the fossil fuel industry. And so we have more storms, and we've seen time after time. And, you know, not just in the Gulf, we saw Superstorm Sandy. And then you have out west where you have the terrible fires. Okay, I don't have to explain that to you, and the droughts. And so it's much more severe, and it's much harder. And so for the people who are already deeply impacted globally, you know, you can't recover if you've been redlined and you never first off, insurance wasn't available to you. And then second, you can't even afford it. And so you don't even have your home or your land. You can't even pass it on to your children. You can't even pass along that generational wealth. And so it's just spiraling now. And it's very sad because the same folks keeps happening too. I have a real problem with that term resilience because, you know, people you can't, if you're older, particularly, you know, if you look at Lake Charles, Louisiana, Calcasieu Parish, they've been hit so many times, and it's just really nigh impossible to bring back what was happening. It's very difficult to deal with, you know, the graves of your grandparents, the caskets coming up out of the land, you know, and having to deal with all these impacts, and your way of life. And so globally, we're seeing, you know, the island nations being inundated with water, and other places of the world, the drought. So there's migration and there's conflict. Women are always, and children and vulnerable populations are always impacted deeply on top of that. And so, you know, but these folks do have the solutions. And I have to, you know, this administration the Biden administration created the White House EJ Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. There are about 50 folks from all over the country who are on the ground, leaders in their communities who've been working on these issues for very, very long time. And so I'm very encouraged about that, the Justice 40 initiative. And, you know, the EPA is now turning around, and, you know, we are pushing OECA, the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Insurance, to do enhanced enforcement for air toxics, problems with expanding refineries. We have fugitive emissions that need to be controlled. All these things are being finally addressed in this administration. So I'm very hopeful, because we have a combination of community people on every level. This is what's so exciting. That's why I love EJs, because you can get involved on every level, locally or federally now, and internationally, and set your own table, you know, and push your agenda with your community, whether it's just to clean up your school or your river, or to tackle climate change in coalition. And so that's what's very exciting. And a lot of people have been involved. And we have, you know, in the CBC historically has been very good on EJ, and been a lot of great leaders over the years, including yourself, Congressman Neguse. So, you know, EJ is now in the lexicon. It's being taught in every university. It's out there, and we cannot practice environmentalism unless EJ is the vanguard to the environmental movement now. So I'm excited. I'm optimistic. It's a lot of hard work, but it is joyous work, because we do wrap it in preserving culture. And so you know, and then the opportunity we have a labor and economic justice program. So we're working very hard on the clean energy sector and a just transition. And the clean energy section was hit very hard by COVID, but there's opportunities, as you know, in the budget reconciliation, maybe get some investments to support that. So happy to defer to that later. But I think that there's so many great people involved, and it's easier to get involved in many respects. So we're going to, I'm optimistic, especially this generation that's gonna take us to the promised land. I feel like I'm the mountaintop generation. I got us, you know, they've got this, we got you and these others, and take us to the promised land.
Well, speaking of which, it's a great segue, because as we think about engaging folks and kind of broadening the tent, I think Laura and Taisha in particular, their organizations, you know, really are kind of very centrally focused on this. And I wonder if Taisha, and maybe we'll start with Laura and then go to Taisha on this same question of, well, I guess two different questions. One is to the extent that you want to add on to what Leslie said regarding the impacts of climate change on on underrepresented communities, but then also more broadly, what you think of as sort of outdoor equity and how that interplays with that same conversation. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about, and I'm reminded of something Taisha said, we talk a lot about preserving these public lands that we're so blessed to have in our country for future generations. But too often, that commitment leaves out Black communities and Brown communities. And so I guess I just wonder if you might have anything to add on that front.
Absolutely. I think something that Leslie just mentioned, the lexicon, is so important in how we start to understand environmental justice, climate crisis, climate change, intersectional environmentalism. And it's creating this framework where we're all sitting and talking about the same things and using the same words. And we're starting to understand what that means across the board for everyone. And for us, for outdoor equity, I think a lot of it has to do with making space for these people, young people, to feel comfortable in outdoor spaces, not just to recreate, but to study, to learn, to build careers. And that equity really begins with being intentional and thoughtful about creating those kind of opportunities for them, and not just in a project sense, but in a whole program, and something that will be long-standing and that will continue to serve them as they go through their career, not just something that's recreational and you get to go outside and have a little fun. Like, these young people that come through our program, they are deeply motivated, extremely educated. So many kids have these incredible environmental science degrees, undergrad, master's degrees. This is what they want to do with their life, and making space for them in this space and equity just to be out there and to be comfortable is so important, and important for us. And that's why we are very intentional about who we hire into our program. And I kind of want to fight back against the narrative that there aren't a lot of kids of color that want to do this work. We have a lot, thousands. And if we could just create the programs, encourage them, and like I said, give them space to lead in outdoor equity spaces, they will create solutions, and not just for their communities, overall for our global climate crisis. So I'm encouraged by the momentum the movement's having, and just like we said, like the lexicon, and that we're really starting to understand the words we're using and the intention behind that, and ultimately the goal behind the environmental justice movement as a whole.
I couldn't agree more. Taisha, what do you think? Are we going to get to the promised land on outdoor equity, as Leslie so eloquently stated?
Hey, I always like to say that we are on an intergenerational journey towards collective liberation and collective stewardship of our lands, wildlife, and waterways. And so, yes, I believe we will get there. When? Not sure, but it's our turn to move it down. And I remember being that young person and wanting, and now I'm that older person wanting. This is an intergenerational, not only journey, but all hands on deck. So Outdoor Afro, we're not a youth organization or adults. We are intergenerational for a purpose. Youth don't fall out of the sky. Youth don't vote. You don't pay taxes. But you know who does? Their family, right? Their communities do. So how do you create opportunities? And I appreciate all the youth programming, certainly, but also recognizing that we have been disconnected intentionally through legislation at the federal, state, and local levels that have resulted in underrepresentation, right? But the desire to belong and be a part is something that has always existed. And even in spite of the legal barriers for participation, many of our ancestors still, with the threat of death, with the threat of jail, show up, right, and contribute and be a part of. So again, from an Outdoor Afro perspective, I will say, it is about that precise language, following on some of the other panelists, and really unpacking and being explicit around what you mean by these terms. So thank you, Congressman Neguse, for the opportunity to actually discuss what we mean by equity, right? We can't just gloss over it and assume that we all mean the same thing. I was an educational equity specialist for like 20 years, right? And one of the things I noticed is that we all use that term very differently. We measure the outcomes of that term very differently. And so at Outdoor Afro, I lean on some of the research. Again, educational equity research base is very extensive, y'all, in the environmental space. Go check it out. It's still relevant to in the environmental space. But I use 4 levers of access, representation, meaningful participation, and quality experiences. I have noticed a very heavy focus on access only. And I will say, access only will not get us to the promised land, right? Access must always be coupled with representation, right? Who makes his decisions? We've talked about this before in a leadership capacity, right? But also I look to the other levers of meaningful participation, looking beyond the focus group, the advisory council, the listening tour. What are the day-to-day engagement opportunities, right? For all of those of us who are impacted by our policies, but also contribute to the health of our planet. And then lastly, quality. And again, I appreciate the efforts of everyone on this panel who are looking at quality outcomes. So again, are they disproportionate? Are they not? But also experiences. At Outdoor Afro, we want you to have quality experiences as well. It's not enough just go to a lake and then be surrounded by 100 other people. I mean, that has impacts on the quality for other people, but also the land itself. And so being mindful of the quality of the relationship, whether it be the relationship to each other or a relationship to our natural resources. Thank you.
Well, Taisha, you've given us a great segue to a question that I have for Happy. I mean, this is ALC, and so we've got a lot of folks who are watching and who will be participating in this conversation during this virtual conference, who are thinking about their own careers and what those careers will look like. And Happy, you have had such an illustrious career as a public servant in Colorado and beyond. And as we talk about folks stepping up and not just it being about sort of myopically access, but really leadership, right? And the person who makes those decisions, that's you for the city of county of Denver. And I guess I wonder whether you have some insights to offer to folks who might be exploring or thinking about a career in outdoor recreation, outdoor equity, environmental justice, environmental policy more broadly, and what advice you would give. You're one of only a few Black Americans to be serving in the role that you have currently. So I think your insights would be very meaningful to the attendees today.
Well, thank you for that question, Congressman Neguse. And like my other colleagues, it all started as by lifeguarding, learning how to swim, and I think my starting out in my career in state and local government, I wanted to be a person who was where the decisions were being made. It was something early in life that I learned was what affects me most are the decisions that were made either without me or with me. And so many of my fellow panelists today have been talking about that, not only the seat at the table, but it's not enough. Certainly the quality of experiences. And those experiences are what guide you to want to be involved in the policy. My experiences as the only one, so to speak, as Taisha was mentioning, led me to say, we have to change somehow what the policies are, who's providing and controlling access. And how you do that is by having people represented and having people not only at the table, but setting the menu, making the decisions. And in Denver, for example, we are now using an equity lens around our budget policy. So when we submit our budgets, every single agency has to explain how those budget requests are affecting communities of color, affecting low income and traditionally underserved communities, and how their proposals will reverse that and provide other outcomes for the way we use our dollars. So a very important impact in environmental justice is, somebody who comes from a finance background, but is committed to the outcomes that we're seeking. So there are many pathways to providing the access that we're talking about, and the stewardship, the shared stewardship that our communities deserve in our natural resources, in with our natural resources, whether it is, I mentioned engineering, and experiences that we've had with the young people that we're working on our projects, of learning what it means to actually design a park. And what does it mean to design one of our waterways that are going to reduce flooding in their neighborhoods? And kids, young people, the adults, their grandparents, their families have experienced these either disparities or opportunities. And so we just need to provide the pathways and the opportunities for folks to step in, whether it's experiencing a youth program. The youth corps across this country have done a great deal towards breaking down some of those barriers. I want to see those young people in positions like mine, and like Taisha's and Laura's and Leslie's in the future. And for every one of us, we need 100 other following in our footsteps. And so the things that we do in our respective organizations to provide that opportunity, not a one-for-one, one person following me, but many. And that is what I hope will change. And what you're doing, Congressman, is the policy level. What you're doing with this proposal on CCC camps is going to change the game for young people in all of our communities to get engaged in our outdoors and in our outdoor resources. And that's where our future leaders are going to come from.
Well, you're very kind, and you have what a great note to close on, although there's still so much more I wanted to discuss.
Yeah.
This conversation's been so robust, but from urban parks to the CCC proposal and many others. But I think I would just say thank you to the four of you for your leadership, for all the work that you're doing in your respective organizations and beyond. And perhaps most importantly, for serving as an inspiration, I think inspiring a lot of folks out there who are watching today's program and beyond to do the same, to, just as you said, Happy, to identify those pathways, to develop those pathways, to develop those opportunities, to pay it forward in a meaningful way. And so I'm grateful for your work, and what an incredible honor for me to be joined by four Black women who are doing such incredible work in the environmental and climate justice space. So often these conversations, I must confess to you, when I'm having them, in Washington, D.C., oftentimes there are not Black voices in the room, much less at the table. And so I just want to say I'm very grateful to the four of you, and I hope everyone who's watching this particular ALC program, heeds the lesson that we are imparting to our audience here today, which is that it's up to us, right? And in order to save our planet, the Black community is, of course, going to have to be and will be deeply engaged in that struggle. So I thank all of you for the work that you're doing, and we thank everyone who tuned in today for this important program. Take care.